Tucker Bates found the air in Joel French's office to be musty and uncomfortably warm. That was typical of the South, though, especially as late spring eased into early summer. And it was now May. Tucker had nothing against the South per se, but after 3 years down here, he still couldn't get used to the heat. He was originally from Pittsburgh. He would never have come to Virginia at all, if not for his partial scholarship at a major university in the Washington, D.C. area. Tucker shifted his body in the visitor's chair opposite Joel's big antique desk. The visitor's chair was an antique, too. It had a dark hardwood frame with old-fashioned red velvet upholstery. Joel French glanced up at Tucker. "Not much longer," he said as he continued reading. "I'm on your resume now." "No problem," Tucker replied with artificial breeziness. What else was he going to say? He was the supplicant here after all. Joel French was about 45 years old. Joel was the general manager of George Washington Investments, a very small brokerage firm in rural Virginia, just outside the D.C. megalopolis. Tucker needed this job. The financial industry was in the doldrums this year, and college students in the finance field were taking whatever they could get this summer. Paid co-op positions, like the one on offer here, were few and far between. Joel nodded inscrutably as he read through Tucker's application file, including his resume, marking various sections with a bright yellow highlighter. Just give me the job already, Tucker thought, but dared not say. While Joel read, Tucker found his gaze drawn to the painting behind French's desk, the prayer at Valley Forge. The painting was a copy, of course. Tucker had seen it many times in textbooks and museums. The beleaguered General Washington, kneeling in the snow in prayer beside his horse during that hopeless winter of 1776. Although Tucker was a finance major, he had gotten an A in every history class he had ever taken. Please, General Washington, pray for me too, Tucker thought. At that moment, Tucker heard a set of footsteps immediately behind his chair. He turned around and saw no one. There was nothing there but the wide expanse of Joel French's private office, with its high ceiling, more antique furniture, and the large Persian rug that covered the hardwood floor. Sunlight streamed in through the tall windows at the far end of the room. But Tucker and Joel French were the only ones in the office. No one had walked up behind him. Tucker resumed staring at the painting, General Washington praying in the snow. Joel finally looked up from the file. He noticed where Tucker was looking. "Ah, yes, I see you've noticed the painting. I find it very inspiring myself. Sometimes on days when I'm feeling the pressure and things seem a little grim, I look at that painting and I remind myself of what our company's founder and owner once endured." Founder and owner, Tucker thought. What? Tucker now noticed a few more items on Joel's desk. A miniature bronze bust of George Washington, then a white ceramic pen holder that bore a portrait of Washington. The likeness of the father of his country was seemingly everywhere in this office. When Tucker had sat down, he had noticed the presidential Lansdowne portrait, a copy, of course, of Washington on the adjacent wall. But the name of the company was George Washington Investments, after all. Maybe it was only a branding thing. What had Joel meant, though, by founder and owner? I should ask, Tucker thought. No, I shouldn't ask. Anyway, Joel went on, you're looking for a paid co-op position that gives you an opportunity to actually work as a broker, correct? Absolutely, Tucker said, perhaps a little too emphatically. I know this hasn't been a good year for co-op students in finance, nor for job seekers either. No, it hasn't, Tucker agreed. Well, I am gratified to see that you're frank and honest. Here at George Washington Investments, we value honesty as one of our core values. As our founder and company owner is reputed to have once said, I cannot tell a lie. Tucker stared back at Joel, wide-eyed. Joel broke into a smile. I do have some good news for you, though, Tucker. I've given your file a thorough perusal. Your grades are excellent. Your resume is a little thin, which is to be expected for a person your age. But you've made the most of the time you've had. Your letters of recommendation are glowing. Unless something unexpected comes up on your background check or drug test, and I don't expect that, of course, I believe that we can offer you the paid summer co-op position. Thank you, Tucker said, exhaling audibly. He felt suddenly light, a weight having lifted off his shoulders. He was going to be one of the lucky ones after all. He wasn't going to spend the summer flipping burgers. This is how it will work, Joel went on. For the length of the summer term, You'll be paid at the prorated salary of a junior, first-year broker with all the applicable commissions. Joel then proceeded to give Tucker some numbers, a rough estimate of how much money he could expect to make over the summer. Will that be satisfactory? Joel asked when he had finished. More than satisfactory, Tucker said, beaming. I accept. Joel smiled and nodded, genuinely happy with Tucker's reaction. I can't promise you a job after graduation, Tucker, but I can tell you this. If your summer co-op term goes well, you'll have a leg up on other new graduates should you decide to apply for a regular, full-time position. We have a few new ones open up each year typically. George Washington Investments is a small firm, as you've probably noticed. We have a very unique, informal corporate culture here, but it suits us well, I think you'll find. I've always thought that it would be rewarding to work in a small firm where you can know all of your colleagues. I find that appealing. Tucker wondered if he had just laid it on a bit too thick there. Those last two sentences had been less than honest. Tucker would have much rather been sitting in the office of a big brokerage house in New York or Chicago right now. But none of those firms had summoned him for an in-person interview. That's good to hear. Joel stood, leaned across the desk, and offered Tucker his hand. Welcome aboard, Tucker. Even if it turns out to be only for the summer, we look forward to you working with us. Tucker stood to shake hands with Joel. The older man was about Tucker's height, but also about 40 pounds heavier. His face had a pasty hue. Despite the warm Virginia climate, Joel probably didn't get out in the sun much. Then Joel stepped around the desk and stood beside Tucker. And then things got weird again. Joel put an avuncular hand on Tucker's shoulder, an unthinkable intimacy in New York or Chicago. But things were different here. You see that? Joel said. Joel indicated yet another painting, this one on the wall beside them. This painting, too, was familiar to Tucker. It was a reproduction of Washington crossing the Delaware. I see it, Tucker said. See Washington standing in the prow of the boat? See the men pushing the boat through the ice floes? We both know that is only an artist's depiction, but something like that really happened. Washington and his men were on their way to sack the Hessian encampment at Trenton that night. It was Christmas night, 1776. Impressive, Tucker said. He remembered what Joel had said about George Washington just a few minutes ago. How could he forget? As I told you, Tucker, we have our own unique culture here at George Washington Investments, and our founder is a key part of it. As he once said, perseverance and spirit have done wonders in all ages. The old man doesn't get into the office much nowadays, but his words and his deeds continue to inspire us every day. What the hell? Tucker was feeling the slightest tinge of annoyance now. He knew that the names of the founding fathers were in the public domain, and more than one company had used them over the years. There were Ben Franklin, five and dime stores in many American small towns. There was the John Hancock Life Insurance Company. Tucker supposed that more than a few companies had taken the name of George Washington too. That was all fine and good as a branding strategy, but Joel was taking the George Washington shtick a bit too far, wasn't he? Maybe this was a test of some kind. Tucker would find out. Just to be clear, Tucker said, when you say the founder, you aren't talking about the actual founder of this brokerage house, right? Of course I am, Joel said. I know George Washington. He's quite an inspiring individual, let me tell you. You know George Washington? You've met him? Why, yes, I've met him many times, in fact. Tucker held his growing annoyance in check, thinking about that prorated junior broker's salary and those applicable commissions. This man was pulling his leg, obviously, though the reason for that wasn't yet clear. But Tucker couldn't let it go. You don't mean the George Washington? President Washington? General Washington? Oh, Joel said, Mr. Washington hasn't officially held the title of president for quite some time. And as for the title of general, well, he does have a very distinguished military record, though he doesn't like to talk about it. Tucker tried to speak but found himself at a complete loss for words. Then Joel added something else. You'll have a chance to meet Mr. Washington for yourself, Tucker, before the end of the summer. Tucker had a sudden, unwanted image of Joel driving him to Mount Vernon, not far from here, and then taking him into the crypt of George Washington. He imagined Joel prying open Washington's white marble sarcophagus and Tucker pushed the images away. They were as ridiculous as they were macabre. But what else could Joel be saying? Well then, Joel said, stepping around Tucker and back to his desk. We'll see you here on the first Monday in June, in just a few weeks, at 8 a.m. Oh, would you like me to show you around the facilities here before you go? He added this last as an obvious afterthought. Thanks, Tucker said, but I can see that you're busy, and I'll have plenty of time to see your facilities over the summer, right? That logic made sense to Joel, apparently. He was already seated behind his desk again. I do have some important calls to return, now that you mention it, but I'm glad we were able to meet today and come to an understanding. Understanding? Tucker was uncertain if Joel was referring to the summer co-op position, this George Washington nonsense, or perhaps both. I'll let myself out, Tucker said. Thank you again, Mr. French. I appreciate everything. Thank you so much for the opportunity. As we've discussed, this is a rough year for students in the finance field. Joel gave Tucker a final friendly wave and reached for his desk phone. No problem, Tucker. How far you go in life depends on your being tender with the young, compassionate with the aged, sympathetic with the striving, and tolerant of the weak and the strong. Because someday in life, you will have been all of these. Now take care, and we'll see you again in just a few weeks. Tucker nodded goodbye but said no more. He had a feeling that Joel's parting words were quoted, and he didn't have to ask whom they were quoted from. The George Washington investments firm occupied a sprawling, converted plantation mansion. Joel's first-floor office, with its high ceiling and Persian rug floor, had at one time been one of the mansion's multiple parlors, Tucker supposed. It wasn't like any corporate office that Tucker had ever seen. But then, neither was the rest of the building. The doorway of Joel's office was just a wide-open space with no physical barrier. Tucker stepped across the threshold, off the Persian rug, and onto the hardwood floor of the main hallway of the mansion. He came immediately upon a large staircase with an ornate balustrade. He had briefly noticed both on his way in. He was about to walk past the stairs when the sound of footfalls came from directly above him on the second floor. Two distinct thumps, then silence. Tucker paused, feeling a slight chill in the stuffy air. He glanced up the staircase. He could see only to the first landing, where a large antique mirror permitted a partial view of the next landing up. Tucker looked in the mirror for any sign of movement. He held his breath. All he could hear, though, was Joel talking to a client in his office across the hall. Seeing nothing and hearing no more, Tucker continued on toward the main exit. The main foyer of the house had been converted to a small lobby. There was no receptionist or security guard. There were 2 chairs and a sofa for visitors. A glass-topped coffee table was covered with recent copies of Time, Newsweek, and Sports Illustrated, arranged in a fan pattern. Tucker heard a creaking sound and looked up. High above his head was a large crystal chandelier. The chandelier was moving, just a little, from one side to the other. A house this size would have drafts, Tucker thought. Its own interior weather patterns, practically. There was a rational explanation. Without lingering any further, Tucker hurried out the main exit of the building. On the other side of the front door, Tucker found himself on a long covered portico. A series of 4 Doric columns supported a white wooden awning 2 stories above his head. The air out here was humid in the late May sunshine, also thick with the scent of pollen. No wonder. A row of blooming magnolia trees lined the front perimeter of the main yard, just before the rural highway that connected the old plantation with the present century. Blooming rose bushes rimmed the front porch. Bees and wasps buzzed everywhere. Hay fever weather. Tucker started as something thumped against the front door from the inside of the house. Joel, perhaps? Had the general manager followed him out? For some reason? Tucker stood still, waiting for the doorknob to turn, waiting for another thump. Nothing. It was just the old architecture settling, he decided. Nothing more. The parking lot was a cleared and black-topped rectangle beside the mansion. It didn't take much suggestibility to imagine this space being used as a parking area for horse-drawn carriages in another era. From the carriages, there would have emerged men in frock coats and top hats, women in crinoline dresses and whalebone corsets. Attended by slaves, of course. This had once been a plantation, and Virginia had been the heart of the old Confederacy. A lost world, Tucker thought. He started his car and reached for the knob that controlled the air conditioning. Although he would be back here in 2 weeks, he had had enough of George Washington Investments and this plantation house for a single day. As he drove home, Tucker savored the triumph of the job offer, but he couldn't shake the eerie feeling left over from that conversation with Joel French. Why couldn't Joel have told him the truth? The mere fact that the firm had been founded by a man named George Washington was an interesting tidbit, but nothing extremely unusual. In the more than 200 years since the real George Washington had died, countless American men had been named for him, after all. One of the most famous of these was George Washington Carver. Born a slave in the waning days of the Confederacy, George Washington Carver had become an accomplished botanist and carried out groundbreaking experiments on the cultivation of peanuts and soybeans. Carver's connection to his namesake had been merely incidental. The George Washington who had founded George Washington Investments, by contrast, had obviously wanted to turn the associations of his name into a commercial gimmick. Joel, the general manager of the firm, had gone along. Fine and good, but why carry an inside joke so far? Tucker had been led to believe that that sort of pranking was for teenagers and college kids. Grown adults didn't do that sort of thing, except some apparently did. When Tucker arrived back at his apartment, he immediately started Googling George Washington Investments. He was able to find a bare-bones corporate presence website with Joel French listed as the general manager. There was an obligatory portrait of the father of his country on the website, but nothing that hinted at the strangeness that Tucker had seen and heard during his interview. On a whim, Tucker started Googling the real George Washington. He thought he already knew much about the man, but apparently he hadn't known everything. He came upon an article entitled Washington's Firing Squads. Apparently, Washington had been responsible not only for the deaths of British soldiers, but for some of his own men as well, and not only deaths on the battlefield. Washington had been a stickler for 18th century standards of military discipline. Continental soldiers who were charged with gross insubordination, assault, or desertion were subjected to drumhead trials. Those found guilty were sentenced to death by firing squad. Anyone charged with treason, meanwhile, was sentenced to hang. Those were hard times, to be sure, and Washington had been fighting a war. Nevertheless, this presented a portrait of Washington that belied his image as the almost saintly, father-like figure. "I wonder if Joel French knows about all that," Tucker said aloud into his empty apartment. Tucker was aware that he was standing on a wooden platform. A scaffold, actually. The scaffold had been erected in the middle of a clearing within a fog-drenched forest. There was a distinct chill in the air, the smell of gunpowder. Tucker's hands were bound behind his back. A rope, a noose to be precise, was tied taut around his neck. Not quite choking him, he could feel the itchy fibers of the rope's hardness. He looked down and got yet another surprise. He wasn't wearing any clothes that he would recognize as his own. He was clad in white breeches and black riding boots. He was wearing some kind of a jacket that was heavy and woolen. From somewhere back in the foggy woods, a crow cawed. Then Tucker heard a slow, rhythmic drum beat. On one side of the scaffold, a row of soldiers became visible, half shrouded by the fog. They wore tricorn hats. About half of them were standing at attention, with muskets at the ready. The other half, bearing drums, were the sources of the beats. Closer to the scaffold, an older male voice said Tucker's full name. Tucker looked down and saw a portly man in a blue uniform standing beside the platform. He wore a tricorn hat, too, and a powdered wig. The stranger raised his hand, and the drum beats stopped. Then he unfurled an old-fashioned scroll. He read aloud from the document in a strange accent that was not quite contemporary American, but not quite British either. "By order of His Excellency, General George Washington, you have been charged with high treason. You have been sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. May the Almighty have mercy on your soul." "No!" Tucker cried out. "I didn't do anything." Tucker heard the slow clopping of an approaching horse. He looked in the direction of the clops and saw a horse and rider approach out of the darkness. George Washington sat atop a black horse. The general wore his military uniform, complete with gold epaulets. He stared directly at Tucker, his face hard and implacable. But that wasn't all. Washington's skin was as white as his powdered wig. He looked skeletal inside his uniform, because he wasn't much more than that, a skeleton. Washington's eyes were two solid black circles. "Tucker," someone else said. Tucker looked down, and Joel was standing at the nearest corner of the scaffold, not far from the man with the scroll. "You see, Tucker," he said, "I told you that you would have a chance to meet George Washington before the end of the summer. Well, now you're meeting him." Tucker awoke in the darkness of his bedroom, breathing hard. He occasionally had dreams that he remembered upon waking, but it had been some time since he had had a nightmare as vivid as this. A few more weeks, he thought, until he reported to George Washington Investments to begin his co-op job. He hoped that the strange events of today, and that horrible dream, had been nothing but jitters, brought on by his anxiety over his employment situation. But he feared otherwise. A few weeks passed, and that first day arrived, right on schedule. When Tucker arrived at George Washington Investments, Joel was waiting for him. "You'll be working in our boiler room," Joel said. "Follow me, and I'll show you." Tucker wasn't alarmed by the term boiler room. In most brokerage houses, the brokers worked in big communal rooms filled with desks and telephones. These were alternately called boiler rooms and bullpens. The boiler room at George Washington Investments was atypical, as Tucker would have expected. The brokers worked in what appeared to be a big converted ballroom. The ballroom had a chandelier similar to the one in the foyer. Large windows with curtains of heavy fabric, providing a wide view of the Virginia countryside. Desks, cubicles, and telephones were set up for about 50 brokers, who were all busy at work when Joel brought Tucker in. Most of them were talking into telephone headsets. Others were tapping away at their keyboards. At the very back of the room was an alcove with an arched ceiling. There was a dark red curtain at the back of the alcove. On a raised platform within the alcove, Tucker saw a large white marble bust of, guess who? The figure of George Washington cast in marble gazed out on the brokers as if supervising them. "You're going to be working with Mike Stinson," Joel said, leading Tucker toward a 20-something man at a cubicle near the back of the room. "Mike is a third-year broker. He'll show you the ropes." Joel made the introductions. Mike stood to shake hands. Then Joel departed, back to his office. The handoff complete, Tucker figured he wouldn't see much more of Joel that summer. Mike was a big, tow-headed guy with a broad frame and a cleft chin. He was obsessed with spectator sports and claimed to have been a minor sensation as a high school running back during his glory days, barely a decade ago. Mike revealed that he was a graduate of Penn State. He was originally from the Philadelphia area. Tucker mentioned that he was from Pittsburgh, at the opposite east-west end of the Keystone State. Tucker wondered if Joel had intentionally paired him with a fellow Pennsylvanian. Possibly. There would be some natural rapport between two young men from the same northern state who found themselves together in the South. Tucker spent most of the morning shadowing Mike, watching over his shoulder as Mike demonstrated order-taking procedures and showed him how to use the company's databases. A little before lunch, Tucker asked the question that had been on his mind since the interview in May. "About all this business with George Washington," Tucker began. "What about it?" Mike said, without looking away from the computer screen. "What about it? I mean, come on, don't you think they carry the Washington thing a little too far? It's all fake after all." Mike stopped what he was doing and turned to look at Tucker. "Why would you think that it's all fake?" he asked, deadpan. "This is your first day on the job and you know all about us? You know what's fake here and what's real? Is that what you're telling me?" Mike's tone wasn't exactly hostile, but it wasn't exactly friendly either. "Never mind," Tucker said. "Anyway, you were telling me about the company's ordering-taking system." At lunchtime, Tucker drove alone to a strip mall near the interstate, where he had seen a cluster of fast food restaurants. He had just enough time to buy a burger, fries, and Coke via the drive-thru window, and then consume it all during the drive back. Tucker made no more efforts to engage Mike in meaningful conversation. He kept things strictly work-related, nodding and taking notes while Mike explained the firm's procedures. About an hour after lunch, the hubbub of the boiler room was interrupted by the voice of the firm's general manager. "Hello, everyone," Joel said. But where was Joel? Tucker looked around for the general manager. He was nowhere in the boiler room. Then Tucker spotted the black box shapes of the overhead loudspeakers, mounted at intervals in the ceiling. "No, I thought that everyone might be in the mood for some singing. What do you say?" Joel asked. Tucker guessed that Joel was speaking from his office, though he had seen no audio equipment there during the interview. There were nods and grunts of assent from around the room, as if the general manager were actually present. Very well then, Joel said. Tucker turned to Mike. The song, Mike whispered. He's talking about the song. The song? What song? We sing it once every few weeks. Oh, I guess you don't have a copy of the words. No, Mike, I don't have a copy of the words. It's my first day here, remember? From the overhead speakers came a staticky sound, the little pops of a phonograph or an old vinyl record player. That was followed by antiquated, vaguely classical music. The music began with a single flute, a lilting, sentimental melody. Then a violin took over, and then the brokers in the boiler room began singing. Vain Britons, boast no longer with proud indignity, by land your conquering legions, your matchless strength at sea. Since we, your braver sons incensed, our swords have girded on. Huzzah! 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 For war in Washington! The singing continued like that for several minutes. Whatever this song was, it was a long one. Unable to sing, and feeling that he should be singing, Tucker looked around the room to see what everyone else was doing. They all seemed to know the lyrics or have access to them. Some of the brokers were consulting the lyrics on printed-out sheets. Others were looking at the screens of their computers and smartphones. Still others seemed to have memorized the words of the song and were singing without reference to anything. So far as Tucker could tell, the singing was done without any irony. It wasn't quite cult-like, but it was nothing that Tucker would have expected at an investment company, or now that he thought about it. Maybe it was a little cult-like. Mike sang too, though he didn't have a very good singing voice. Finally it ended. He and Mike resumed Tucker's orientation. I'll get you a copy of the words, Mike said, for next time. Later that evening, Tucker Googled some of the lyrics that he remembered. There was indeed a song called War and Washington, but no one had performed the song in centuries, other than the brokers of George Washington Investments and perhaps the members of a few historical societies. War in Washington had been penned early in the Revolutionary War by one Jonathan M. Sewall. Sewall wrote the song to inspire both civilians and soldiers alike throughout the darkest days of the Revolution, when the success of the American project was by no means certain. According to Wikipedia, War in Washington was to be sung to the tune of The British Grenadiers, a military song of the enemy. As Tucker fell asleep that night, he caught himself mouthing the words, Huzzah! Huzzah! For war in Washington! At the end of his second week on the job, Tucker met Amanda. Amanda was blonde and had a cute figure. Tucker had noticed her his very first day on the job, but he didn't get around to meeting her until the end of the second week. By this time, Tucker was executing his own trades and calling his own clients. He was consulting with Mike only when absolutely necessary, which suited him fine. But the attractive blonde broker was another matter. She seemed to be about the same age as Mike, maybe a second or third-year employee in her mid to late 20s. Tucker happened to catch her alone in the company break room, pouring herself a cup of coffee. He fumbled around with some lame remarks about the weather until she finally let him off the hook. My name's Amanda, she said before Tucker got around to asking her name. I'm Tucker. I know, you're the new co-op. Don't think too much of the fact that I knew your name. There's a whole bunch of us, but only one new co-op. You know? Sure. Okay, Tucker. She withdrew a napkin from a stack on the sink counter beside the coffee machine. She jotted down a phone number and handed him the napkin. Call me if you want to. We'll see how it goes from there. But don't start hanging around my cubicle like a cocker spaniel, okay? Things are busy here and a little competitive, as you've probably gathered. And in a small firm like this, people talk. Okay, Tucker said gamely with a laugh. He accepted the napkin. He shook his head and smiled, watching Amanda walk out of the break room. No woman had ever compared him to a cocker spaniel before. There was no point in wasting time, Tucker reasoned. He didn't call Amanda that very night, but he did call her the night after that. They made a date for dinner for the coming Saturday. Tucker made reservations at a Washington, D.C. restaurant that had an outdoor veranda. After checking the weather forecast, he requested a table on the veranda. The two of them dined in the warm summertime air, with the dome of the U.S. Capitol building lit up in the distance. The conversation was pretty much limited to cautious first date fare, but it went well just the same. Outside George Washington Investments, Amanda seemed to lose the superficial toughness that she affected in the office. Amanda invited him back to her apartment for a nightcap. Tucker was cautiously hopeful about how the evening might end. He was also relieved. He did not want to bring a professional woman who held down a real job back to his student apartment with its secondhand furniture and threadbare carpet. Amanda's apartment was stylish, located in a trendy neighborhood just outside the city. The neighborhood was too pricey for college students like Tucker, but many young professionals rented there. She poured them each a glass of wine. She asked with faux seriousness if Tucker was old enough to drink. This led to a brief conversation about their ages. Amanda was 25 to Tucker's 22. An older woman, but not much older. They were sitting on the sofa in Amanda's living room, their wine glasses on her coffee table. If he was going to make a move tonight, now might be an opportune moment, he thought. She was obviously attracted to him, and they were completely alone. But he found himself thinking instead about George Washington Investments, about the George Washington part specifically. Since his abortive conversation with Mike, Tucker hadn't broached that subject with anyone. The company's strange obsession with George Washington, the omnipresent paintings and sculptures, that bizarre song so out of place in a corporate environment, the persistent group delusion that the original George Washington was somehow still alive and pulling the strings at the investment firm that bore his name. Amanda, Tucker began. Yes? Tell me, what's the story at work? All this nonsense about George Washington? What do you mean nonsense? Tucker groaned inwardly. Was she going to make him spell it out? Joel was the general manager of the firm, and he had to toe the company line at all times. And Mike wasn't exactly the sharpest tack in the box, even though he did have a finance degree from Penn State. But Amanda was bright and headstrong. She seemed to be her own person. I think you know what I mean, he said. Everyone in the company goes along with it. They pretend that George Washington, the man whose bones have lain in a tomb in Mount Vernon for more than 200 years, is the owner of George Washington Investments. Before she could interject, Tucker went on. And they won't admit that they are talking about an ordinary man named after the real George Washington. They insist that they're talking about the actual historical figure, the first president of the United States, the father of his country. He took a deep breath and then a quick sip of the wine Amanda had poured. It's ridiculous. Then he looked at her to see what she might have to say. I don't want to talk about this, Tucker, she said. What? Why? Tucker, despite the speech he had just made, struggled to think of anything else to say. What he was thinking was, not Amanda, too. She can't be just like the others. But apparently she was. Amanda stood and walked across the living room. She opened her front door and held it open. Tucker, thank you for the nice dinner, but I think you should leave now. After that, Tucker drove home. Amanda had thrown him out of her apartment after all. He had no choice but to leave. That night, Tucker went to bed, alone, and in a fitful state. His attractive blonde coworker wasn't with him, of course, but George Washington, the father of his country, did show up. Tucker was crouching in a shallow, hastily dug earthen trench. He was surrounded by other men. Like him, they were all soldiers of the Continental Army. The mood around him was comprised of equal parts terror and desperation. They're going to overrun us, someone shouted off to Tucker's right. All around him were the sounds of war, the crack of muskets, the sporadic booms of cannons, the groans of the dying. The air smelled of gunpowder smoke and the open bodies of men. Very close to Tucker, there was the softer, compound sound of a lead object striking flesh and cracking bone. It was followed by a muffled cry that was choked off by death. Tucker looked. The man directly beside him had been struck in the forehead by a British musket ball. Tucker turned away, his movements slow, his control of his body awkward in the dream. The trench represented the front line of the American position. A short distance away, across a grassy field obscured by the haze of smoke, was the main British position. Now someone, a Continental officer, was telling Tucker and the other men to charge. Tucker was suddenly aware that his hands were not empty. He held a Revolutionary War-era Brown Bess musket. Charge, an unseen officer commanded. The men on both sides of Tucker were standing up and clambering out of the trench. They were rushing forward to assault the British position. But Tucker froze. He cowered, in fact, making his body as small as possible in the dream. You're dreaming, he thought. Wake up. He couldn't wake up, though. The dream had him trapped, despite this uncanny lucidity. Behind him, a horse whinnied. Traitor! A gravelly voice shouted. Tucker looked up. Poised over the trench, the zombie George Washington sat atop his mount. He was a faded, decaying shadow of the man on the U.S. dollar bill. Nevertheless, the general was ready for battle, his sword unsheathed in one bony hand. Traitors! Washington bellowed over the clamor of war. I will not abide, traitors. Washington raised his sword and bore down on Tucker. And Tucker woke up. His heart was pounding. He walked into his bathroom and emptied his bladder. Afterward, he lay back down in the darkness and stared at the ceiling for quite some time. Even Amanda was part of it. Perhaps they were putting him on. A big coordinated joke, or perhaps it was a mass delusion, or there was another possibility, wasn't there? One that he had dared not consider. Was if it was all true? Tucker returned to work the following Monday. He was determined now to grit his teeth and get through the rest of his co-op period as an act of pure will. He had long since jettisoned any notion of applying for a full-time position with George Washington Investments following his graduation. Maybe he would rather flip burgers than resign himself to a career at that bizarre firm. One afternoon, several weeks after his crash-and-burn date with Amanda, Tucker returned to the office after lunch and noticed a general hubbub in the boiler room. Then the other brokers were getting up from their seats and forming a queue to exit the room. Mike was nearby, so Tucker asked him, "What's going on? A fire drill? Or a staff meeting, maybe?" "No," Mike said. "The owner is here, the big man himself. He's come in for a visit." "George Washington," Tucker said. "Our president and owner?" Even after all these weeks on the job, Tucker couldn't resist taking a contrarian stand about the George Washington thing whenever the topic arose. In order to avoid becoming a pariah in the office, Tucker had deliberately kept to himself. He had eaten lunch alone every single day since coming on the job. He was on a first-name basis with most of the brokers by now, but he had made no real friendships. "He's not technically our president anymore," Mike allowed. "One of his descendants has taken over, I think, or will soon." "His children," Tucker pressed. "Children or grandchildren or something like that. Maybe one of his great-grandchildren. Several generations down he might be. I don't know. I do know that the owner has kids, and his kids have had kids. Washington is still our president emeritus, though. He's the big man around here." "One of his descendants, you said. One of his descendants will be taking over the company? Or already has?" "That's what I just said." Mike stood. "Anyway, I'm not going to miss out on his visit." "What's the occasion?" Tucker asked. Mike was clearly impatient to join the queue filing out of the boiler room. "The 4th, of course, this weekend." "You mean Independence Day?" Mike looked at Tucker as if he were a complete simpleton. "Of course I mean Independence Day. The owner usually comes in the week before the long holiday. After all, Independence Day is his holiday more than anyone else's." "Of course it is," Tucker said, and went back to what he was doing. Tucker watched his colleagues for the summer jostle out the narrow space of the doorway between the boiler room and the main hallway. They were professionals in the finance field, no less, and they were maintaining order. But they were visibly eager to see the big man, George Washington, the father of his country. Tucker's first inclination was to skip the visit. He didn't really want to see. Moreover, he had a lot of work to do this afternoon. He had to enter a whole stack of orders for the Zwiller account, one of the firm's larger and more important customers. Then he thought, no, I do want to see. "What are you doing?" a familiar female voice asked as he was getting up from his chair. Amanda. Since their one and only date, Tucker and Amanda had reconciled. To a degree, they had both agreed, without explicitly saying as much, that they needed to be on speaking terms if they were going to work together. When they passed in the hallway or the break room, they said their hellos, but there were to be no more dinner dates. "What am I doing?" Tucker said. "I had been entering orders for the Zwiller account, But right now I'm going out to meet George Washington, the man of the hour, the president emeritus of the company, and of our country. I don't think that would be such a good idea, Amanda said. The best thing, I think, would be for you to stay here and finish the inputs for the Zwiller account. You go out there. It will only mean trouble. That's my decision, though, isn't it? Yes, she said. Yes, I suppose it is. Amanda didn't linger. She turned and headed toward the queue of brokers. Whatever her advice for Tucker, she had no intention of missing out on George Washington's visit herself. Tucker briefly considered heeding Amanda's advice. He remembered something that Mike had revealed and told himself that he was better off not seeing the esteemed visitor. In a manner of speaking, Amanda had given him sage advice, but then he realized that he could not let it go. He stood up and went to join his colleagues. Tucker was literally the last person in the line out the door. With some effort, he squeezed into the hallway. He could tell from the direction in which everyone was straining to look that George Washington was in the foyer of the building, beneath the big chandelier. Tucker had to see him, and now that he was this close, he was determined to see him. He moved forward through the crowd of his colleagues, gently but insistently pushing people aside. He was on the receiving end of a few frowns. Mostly, though, people seemed to understand. Perhaps some of them even made special allowances for him. This would be his first time to actually see the great man. Tucker continued to squeeze forward. Finally, he reached a position where he could see. At the front of the crowd, in the open space that the employees of George Washington Investments had made, was the president emeritus. He did exist, after all. George Washington was standing in the mansion's foyer with the aid of a walker. His skin was wrinkled and covered with liver spots. He was nearly bald, save for a few wispy patches of white hair. Washington surveyed the crowd through thick, plastic-rimmed glasses. He smiled at their greetings, which he heard with the assistance of a hearing aid. He was very short, perhaps 5'5" or 5'6". Tucker assumed that his short stature could be partially attributed to age-related shrinkage. But how old was he exactly? Beyond a certain degree of elderliness, precise ages are difficult to tell at a glance. Tucker would have guessed that the old man in the lobby was in his mid-80s, but he might have been in his 90s. 96 or 97 would not have been out of the question. He recalled what Joel had said during the interview about the very distinguished military record of the company's president emeritus and founder. This man in the lobby was likely a member of that dwindling population of World War II veterans. He might have seen action in the Battle of the Bulge or on Guadalcanal. He might very well have a distinguished military record, but he had had nothing to do with the American Revolutionary War. That man in the foyer had never prayed in the snow at Valley Forge. He had not stood in the prow of that boat as it crossed the ice-choked Delaware River. He had not accepted the surrender of Lord Cornwallis. He had never ordered the firing squads of Continental Army deserters. Not this man. Of course not. I was mistaken, Tucker thought. All this time since the interview in Joel's office, I've been misinterpreting them. They haven't really been trying to tell me that this man is the George Washington. Somehow I've been imagining that. I was my misperception. Then he heard one male broker say, "We're cleaning up in the marketplace, Mr. Washington." And another said, "Just like you cleaned up those Hessians at Trenton." Then a woman chimed in, "Yeah, and at Yorktown, too." Tucker could take it no more. He elbowed his way through to the very front. Then he broke through to the cleared space so that he was standing beside the man behind the walker. At first, no one reacted. Most of them probably assumed that Tucker had been especially eager to greet the president emeritus of the company. But when Tucker whirled on his colleagues, the crowd went completely still. "This man isn't George Washington," Tucker shouted. Dead silence. Everyone was staring at him. So Tucker went on. "What are you people talking about? Trenton and Yorktown? This is all a fraud. He isn't George Washington." "Excuse me," said the diminutive man beside Tucker. George Washington. This was the first time Tucker had heard him speak. His voice was low and high-pitched, but he spoke deliberately and without any trace of mental senescence. "I am George Washington. That's what it says on my birth certificate. That's the name on all my driver's licenses, too, though I haven't driven a motor vehicle for more than 15 years. But Tucker was having no more of such double talk. The deliberate obtuseness. "You know what I mean," he said. He was inclined to go easy on the old fellow, but he sensed that the president emeritus was part of the fraud too, the sham that had been orchestrated on Tucker since his interview in Joel's office. His name might be George Washington, Tucker said, but he isn't the George Washington. He's one of the countless American men who have been named after George Washington over the past 200 years. Nothing more, yet you've all been pretending otherwise. Tucker looked from person to person, expecting someone to offer an explanation. He was actually hoping for a confirmation of his suspicion that this was all a big misunderstanding on his part, but that was becoming almost impossible to believe. Do you want to know how I knew? I was told that one of his descendants had taken over as president of the company. Tucker waited for them to get it, but none of them understood apparently. They hadn't gotten A's in their American history courses. Well, the real George Washington didn't leave any descendants. Historians believe that he was sterile. Tucker turned to the old man behind the walker. George Washington looked back at him, but Tucker could not see his eyes through those thick lenses. After a few seconds, the old man looked down at the floor. He had defeated a man pushing 90, maybe 100. Tucker felt like a heel, but on the other hand, someone had had to say something, right? This mass delusion couldn't be allowed to persist. It made no sense after all. Tucker's colleagues were looking at him. Tucker scanned the crowd and saw nothing but hostile faces. What had he done? He had thought that maybe, just maybe, they might congratulate him for breaking the spell. But there was no trace of gratitude in their stony stares. He found Amanda one row back. She frowned with genuine regret, genuine sympathy for this position that Tucker had insisted on getting himself into. Hadn't she told him to stay at his desk, and that coming out here would only mean trouble? Amanda slowly shook her head. Her message needed no words. Stop now. End this. Then he saw Mike. Mike's lower lip was trembling with barely constrained rage. In another setting, Tucker was quite certain Mike would have gladly taken a swing at him. Then someone spoke. Joel. Tucker, the general manager said. The crowd parted so Joel French could walk out and stand between Tucker and the crowd. You couldn't let it go, could you, Tucker? But Tucker began. He stopped himself. He really had said enough, he sensed. In an aside to the president emeritus, Joel said, I'm sorry about this, Mr. Washington. George Washington held up one arthritic, lightly trembling hand. That's all right, Joel. It's okay. The boy meant no harm. But from the rest of the crowd there came grumblings of a darker note. He can't treat the general that way. Betrayal. He's betrayed the president. He's betrayed us all. In addition to his history and finance classes, Tucker had taken a psychology class or two, and he knew something about the momentum of mobs. He sensed that this situation was less than a minute away from becoming dangerous. I think you'd better go now, Tucker, Joel said. Yes, Tucker whispered. He was already stepping backward in the direction of the front door. Yes, I think you're right.